what I want is to...
I see that you're using the
I'm having to use the webcam from there, which I know is distinctly suboptimal, but...
Okay.
Okay, no, that's grand.
Committed viewers who want to engage with the lecture, so good few days. Okay. Yeah, please go ahead. Yes. Okay, so let me get started. Welcome everybody to this ASEN debate on Aram Hur's book, The Narratives of Civic Duty. I'm Elliot Green. I'm a professor of development studies here at the LSE. What I'm going to do, I'm going to chair this debate. What I'm going to do is very briefly introduce the book and the topic. Then I'll let Aram say a couple words about the book, introducing it in more detail. And then we will have two debaters, and then Aram will respond to the debaters. So first of all, just to say, this is the book that we are debating today, Narratives of Civic Duty, How National Stories Shape Democracy in Asia, published in 2022 by Aram Hur with Cornell University Press. This is a book which I think is really interesting, not just in terms of its effect or its impact, I think, on the study of Korean politics, Taiwanese politics, Asian politics more generally, but of course on the topic of nationalism, which is why we're here today. It's unusual for us. I'm very glad that we have this book in front of us today. Unusual for us, I think, from ASEN, from the debating perspective, to have a book which is more specific on to a specific region. And I think that's very useful in the sense that, of course, what Aram does is she has very intense discussions of South Korea and Taiwan. Of course, there's also a chapter on Germany and also a broader perspective. But I think it provides an interesting way to approach the topic of nationalism by looking specifically at countries, not just ones that I think have a lot to tell us about nationalism, but also countries which are not normally discussed in the literature on nationalism, at least in terms of the broader comparative literature, which tend to be much more Eurocentric. Also, I think what makes this book interesting is it comes from a political science perspective, multi-methods, both using qualitative and quantitative methodologies. That, again, I think is relatively, not as rare perhaps as a book on nationalism in Asia, but also relatively rare in a field which tends to be more historical, more sociological, and again, more qualitative than quantitative. So those two factors alone, I think, make Aram's book interesting. The fact that she also weaves in discussions of democracy and the role that nationalism plays in generating civic duties, I think, is something that really speaks well, again, to political scientists, but also speaks well to broader discussions around nationalism. So I'm going to let Aram say a little bit more about the book. But first, let me introduce the speakers, and then I'll hand it over to Aram. So our first debater is Atsuko Ichijo, who is an associate professor in sociology in the Department of Criminology, Politics, and Sociology at Kingston University in London. Her research interests are in the field of nationalism studies, and her most recent publications include Nationalism and Subjectivity, East Asian Experiences, which is a forthcoming book with Oxford University Press, as well as articles in journals such as Asian Studies Review, Nationalities Papers, and Nations and Nationalism, among others. She holds degrees from the International Christian University, the University of Tokyo, and the LSE, and is a member of the editorial board of Nations and Nationalism. Our next speaker will be Yookyeong, who's an anthropologist who specializes in law, language, gender and sexuality, and social movements in the context of contemporary Korea. Her research has been supported by the Social Science Research Council, the Werner Green Foundation, and the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies, among others. She is currently working on a book manuscript on how legal advocacy has emerged among the most potent means in South Korean queer activism since the late 2000s. Before joining the University of Sheffield, she was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Korean Studies at the University of Indiana, Bloomington. And lastly, Aram will respond to both debaters. And Aram is the Kinku Chair in Korean Studies and Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Fletcher School at Tufts University in the United States. She's a scholar of nationalism and democracy in East Asia, and this is her first book, which we will be debating here today. It also won the 2023 Robert Dahl Award for scholarship of the highest quality on the subject of democracy from the American Political Science Association. She holds a PhD in politics from Princeton University, an MPP from Harvard Kennedy School, and a BA with honors from Stanford University. So I'll let Aram take over for a few minutes, and then we'll start with Atsuko to start the debate.
So thank you everyone for being here. I understand that at LSE it is exam week, and so kudos to spending that precious time with us today. Since the book is about national stories, I wanted to just start tonight by telling a little bit more of a personal story about the book. So I think in truth I realized in hindsight that I had actually started writing this book much earlier than I had thought. So the book opens with the Asian financial crisis of '97 and the National Gold Drive. And the reason it opens with that is not only because I think it's a splendid example of civic duty, but because it's also a deeply personal event. My father was a career civil servant in the Ministry of Finance in South Korea, and as you can imagine, was very busy during that time. And, you know, me being a young daughter, and as young daughters do, I was badgering him one night and nagged him about why he was not spending more time with his precious daughters and always working. And so this is how he answered that nag. He said, you know, Korea as a nation has been through far worse crises than this. It will get through this one as well, and it's my duty to do everything that I can to help it persevere. Totally unsatisfactory answer for a young daughter, but it was, you know, it made an impression, it stuck with me. And so years later, I was in graduate school when at Princeton, during still what was pretty much the heyday of rational choice theory, and was, you know, found myself getting increasingly frustrated in the Intro to Comparative Politics seminar when we kept reading things like how nationalism was this big stain on world politics, and it was not only detrimental but perhaps sometimes even antithetical to liberal democracy. Group attachments were irrational, and when you had too much of it, when they got too strong, they led to very bad things. And, you know, my lived experience shouted that that could not be the whole story about nationalism. And, you know, it took many years after that, but that ultimately made me write this book about how nationalism, and even that ethnic kind of nationalism, which typically we see as the most dangerous, most irrational kind, can actually be a positive force for democracy by providing this moral impetus for civic duty. And, you know, the book came out in November of 22. I think that, you know, the idea and the evidence collected in the book has really caught sort of a second wind with the rise of populist nationalist movements across the world threatening those very democracies. Even in long-standing democracies like the United States that were thought to be immune to such kind of breakdown. So, you know, I really do feel like, I'm obviously biased, but I do feel like it's more important than ever to really flesh out and understand the contextualities and the nuances of how nationalism intersects with ideas about liberalism, about, you know, resilience of democracy, both in good ways and bad. And so I want to thank you to Professor Green for that lovely introduction. He said far more things about the book than I think I would have ever said about my own. So really appreciate the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism and the LSE for having the foresight to have a book about understudied cases in this field for this year's debate. I genuinely appreciate it, and I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm asked to comment and to raise some questions of this book from a more general point of view, from basically the perspective of national studies and that's what we're trying to do. Aram Hur's narratives of civic duty, how national stories shape democracy in Asia, is a thought-provoking piece of work. It is refreshing for those of us who are interested in the study of nationalism because her challenges the established public policy wisdom about nationalism. Nationalism, as opposed to be patriotism, it's evil, or if it's not done like evil, it has, without exception, negative impact on society in general. What is more, her work also attempts to go beyond what she calls democratic essentialism by questioning a deeply entrenched assumption about nationalism would have a detrimental effect on the health of democracy. What is very exciting in this regard is her case studies, South Korea and Taiwan, two youngish democracies in East Asia, which are not easily associated with democracy in general, and which are often seen as having strong ethnic nationalism. Though in the case of Taiwan, what is ethnic nationalism is rather complicated, as she acknowledges in her volume, and which is still evolving how what is ethnic in Taiwan. It's still contested, daily contested and evolved. Advancing a thesis on possible positive impact on nationalism, on democracy, using cases which do not usually feature in the study of democracy. That is why narratives of civic duty is an exciting piece of work. While her does not give a blanket endorsement of nationalism, she argues ultimately that certain type of nationalism in which national stories enhance people's perception of the strength of connection between the nation, people, and the state will have positive effects on the health of democracy because these national stories would enhance people's sense of civic duty. The book then demonstrates the validity of her argument with case studies of South Korea and Taiwan augmented by that of post-unification Germany. Hur's argument hinges on the role of what she refers to as national stories, an unmistakably qualitative concept, and the work's qualitative insights are supplemented by quantitative analysis, an effective employment of the research strategy of triangulation. In short, this is a fine piece of scholarship which offers exciting insights into nationalism and how it works. In what follows, I would like to lay out my understanding of Hur's argument, though I will not go into the details of quantitative analysis she has carried out as I'm not well versed in that department. I will then offer some comments and raise some questions in order to kickstart the debate. Narratives of civic duty opens with an episode of Mrs. Han, an ordinary South Korean citizen who felt compelled to donate her and her husband's rings and gold bars to the National Bank when South Korea was badly hit by the 1997 financial crisis. The gold drives were not organized by the South Korean state, but started by a women's church group. In the end, about 3.5 million Koreans, 1 in 4 households, joined in and donated their personal gold. The drives raised 225 tons of gold, worth $2 billion US dollars. This was a drop in the ocean as South Korea's debt exceeded $100 million. But this is not the point. Mrs. Han donated her and her husband's personal gold because, I quote, it was the only right thing to do, end quote. Her asks why Mrs. Han and other South Koreans contributed their personal gold to the gold price, and her answer is because of their sense of civic duty. They simply fulfilled what they considered their moral obligation. Moral obligation to whom? It is not very clear at the opening section of the book, but as we go through the volume, it becomes clear that donations were made to Korea, a political community in which the perceived Korean nation and the state are very well aligned. Hurt's claim is that this strong alignment of the nation and state can be brought about by national stories, a product of historicized national identity politics. While duty and moral obligation sounds very confusing, and therefore it can be seen as a threat which is peculiar to South Korea, where Confucianism maintains stronger influence than, say, in Japan, Her reminds us that in the study of democracy, the importance of civic duty has been emphasized from Atsuko onwards. And in the face of democratic backsliding or erosion across the world, the significance of civic duty is attracting renewed interest. So is this a case of Confucianism coming to a rescue of democracy? Woodville argues that the strong sense of civic duty Mrs. Han and other South Koreans felt at the end of the 20th century was not so much a product of Confucian socialization, though it definitely helps, but of a perception of strong linkage between the national people and the state, which has been historically cultivated in the form of national stories. And in this process, nationalism can serve as a resource to strengthen democracy by enhancing people's sense of civic duty, a sense of obligation to be a good citizen. The book then substantiates this claim using personal narratives, opinion polls, and experiments in South Korea and Taiwan. After investigating the two East Asian cases, the book proceeds to examine the case of East Germans in post-unification Germany to show that claim about sense of civic duty holds in a different historical and cultural context. The book concludes with some policy recommendations, some of which are somewhat counterintuitive because of the dominant assumption about the relationship between nationalism and democracy. This is a very rough outline of narratives of civic duty, which does not do justice to its teachings. Whatever I have done is just laying out a minimum so that the question I would like to raise would make sense. Because this is such a stimulating volume, I have a long list of questions, but here I will focus on 4 questions. 2 of them are largely theoretical, one of them is mechanical, and the last one empirical. My first question is inevitably about definition. The question is, what is nationalism in this volume? What I have gathered from the volume is that it is interested in finding out what makes people feel that they have a stake in the polity, which mobilizes them to take certain action to fulfill their civic duty. It argues that it is national stories that facilitate a strong identification between the national people and the state, allowing people to feel the state or the political community as mine. This sense of propriety, as it were, induces behavior out of sense of civic duty. You sacrifice something because it is the right thing to do. The term nationalism is frequently used in the first 2 chapters, and Her clearly rejects the conventional dichotomy of bad nationalism versus good patriotism, and states that the term nationalism is employed in the volume on purpose. The book discusses national attachment and, above all, national stories in the context of nationalism. Nationalism per se is not clearly identified. Perhaps it is because she agrees with Rogers Brubaker in that what is important is to investigate what nationalism does rather than what nationalism is. Because nationalism, nations or national stories are not static or fixed but constantly evolving. But then, what does nationalism do? It's nationalism what national stories do, to tell people how they and the state are related. Is this a discursive practice? In discussing who write national stories, Her acknowledges the significance of top-down influences of the state or the political elite. Although what the state and the political elite do not have the monopoly in writing national stories, in this regard, the book seems to suggest that nationalism is ideology spread from the top, even if it may take a banal form. Being interested in certain nationalism, I would like to welcome Aram to expand on this. Following this, I would like to hear more about theoretical implication of the book's claim. The volume is not content with the established ethnic versus civic nationalism scheme. Her argues that the democratic manifestations of nationalism have less to do with having a good or bad variant and more to do with how different nationalisms are embedded vis-à-vis the state. Yes, thank you. What is interesting in this volume is, of course, a strong manifestation of what appears to be civic nationalism, as seen in overseas Koreans volunteering to take up conscription, in a country which is usually seen as having ethnic nationalism dominant. Of course, an ethnically or even racially defined nation can demonstrate a civic aspect. But what does this mean in thinking about classification of ethnic versus civic nationalism? Does the book's argument question the explanatory power of the classification? In other words, does the classification continue to make sense? Or does Hurt's finding shed light on the relationship between these two types of nationalism? Thirdly, I'd like to expand on the mechanism or process through which national stories, the historicized link between the national people and the state, emerge and are adopted by the people. As touched upon earlier, the volume claims while the state is an active and significant participant in making national stories, really powerful national stories are those which are told through the personal lens. This makes sense, but how these stories emerge away from the state-sponsored structure, such as school curriculum, message control in media and so on, remains rather obscure. I would be glad to hear more about how national stories emerge and how they become successful. And fourthly, an empirical question about Taiwan. I completely agree with the book's analysis that there was a disconnect between the national people and the state in Taiwan when Kuomintang was in power. And the book's investigation into how young Taiwanese saw military service is very illuminating. As such, Taiwanese case study is a great contrast to the South Korea one, and one of the book's strengths is to have identified these two cases for successful, most similar case studies of them. However, analysis carried out for the book covers a period between before the Democratic Progressive Party's victory in 2016, and they are still in power. There has been lots of development there, and especially the PDP is still in power despite CCP's interference, massive interference in the election campaign. Does this mean that now the 63% of the opinion poll is online, would say they identify themselves as Taiwanese only rather than saying they are both Taiwanese and Chinese? So would she say the alignment between the nation and the state has shifted substantially in the period since 2013? So these are the questions I would like to ask, and I just want to make just a few quick points. Significance of the date, 4th of June, the 30th, 36th, the anniversary of the Square incident or massacre, whichever you like to call it, where the issue, the idea of civic duty, nationalism, and quest for democracy certainly emerged. And what we have learned yesterday, the result of the South Korean election, that again, nationalism, democracy, and civic duty seem to be coming out on the surface. So I'm looking forward to discussing these points.
Thank you, Atsuko. Yookyeong.
Oh, put them all together.
Yeah, yes,
Okay.
please, if that's possible.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me in this panel, and I'm delighted to discuss Professor Aram Hur's intellectually stimulating book that can reach broad audiences in comparative politics, East Asian studies, and political sociologists and anthropologists like myself. This book presents a stimulating case for examining the function of nationalism in consolidating people's engagement with civic duty in East Asian democracies. For the purpose of today's event, I was particularly asked to comment on the South Korean case, so I'd like to put on the table a few questions and comments focusing on Korea. My questions aim to seek conceptual and methodological clarity in hopes of better understanding the processual dynamics of national narratives. The book starts with the story of Mrs. Han, who participated in the South Korean gold drive during the 1997 Asian financial crisis to help her country in trouble. Her story reappears multiple times throughout the book as an example of big civic duty to South Korean democracy, stemming from one's sense of national belonging and the perceived association between one's nation and the state. The South Korean case demonstrates how the strong consensus on nation-state linkage leads people to embody a big sense of civic duty internally. In the book, this case starkly contrasts with the Taiwanese case, where the relationship between national identity and state was considered overtly contested depending on one's ethnic national group. And it is argued that stronger national identification increases one's commitment to civic duty in societies where the notions of nation and state form a strong linkage. Especially in South Korean case, this big sense of civic duty has derived from the well-built amalgamation of the Korean ethnic nation based on the consanguine community and the South Korean state. The book critiques flattening presuppositions about the negative role of nationalism in rendering democracies more stable. The author thoughtfully highlights the significance of the nation-state linkage as opposed to a very generic, wholesale description of nationalism in motivating civic engagement. In doing so, she looks at the formation and circulation of national stories, i.e. hegemonic narratives about the relation between a national people as a political entity and the state. The book offers a valuable comparative commentary on the complex interplay between nationalism and democracy, both as ideology and practice. So now I will jump into my questions and comments, and I try to bundle them into 3 themes. The first theme I wanted to share is how to do justice to understanding national identification as a dynamic process. So in the book, Hur rightfully acknowledges the processual nature of identity and argues that national belonging should be understood as identifications as a process that can vary with socio-political context. And I really welcome this perspective, also particularly as an anthropologist, and I cannot agree more on this point about moving away from static conceptualization of identity. What is at stake here then is the power of quotidian regimentation in motivating people's national identification and civic engagement. Understanding the regimentation will help us understand how specific national stories are formed, concretized, and challenged, and I think it's directly connected to Dr. Ichijo's third comment. And this thread of thinking propelled me to look for some traces of such work in the book's main analysis and data explanation sections. Sometimes national stories are presented as an end product or evidence of strong nation-state linkage among the South Korean public discourses. However, some of the South Korean grand national narratives, including those presented in the book, were in fact historically established through a very rocky process involving contentions and conflicts. In other words, those journeys have not always been smooth and clean-surfaced, as they involve othering or marginalizing certain groups, for example. So in this sense, I thought it would be wonderful to hear a little more about the backstories, how the tension between heterogeneity and homogeneity of South Korean polity was considered in the methodological design of this research. And my next question is in the continuum under the same theme about the processual nature of nationalism, which is about the concept of nation. And this is coming from the ethnographic point of view, interested in what are the full concepts of ethno-nation or political, economic, social, and cultural entities people use in their discourses, as well as those used in survey questionnaires. For instance, can the Korean concept, I don't know if everyone speaks Korean in this room, but can the Korean concept of nara, literally usually translated to country in English, be smoothly translated into nation or nation state as analytic concepts deployed in political science? So I'm curious to hear more about what concepts, for example, nara, country, or 민족, nation, or 국가, the state, or etc., were used in the analyzed discourses, the raw data. And people often conflate different concepts in everyday utterances and practices in South Korean everyday political landscape. So I would appreciate it if I could learn more about how the survey and discourse analysis took such a pattern into account in designing and execution. And in the same vein of thought, I actually think this study, which is a fascinating point about this book, I think this study, alongside many other studies of world democracies, is actually hinting at a classic subject in comparative politics and political anthropology, which is critical reconsideration of the explanatory power of nation and state as analytic concepts, which may call for redefining those concepts in different geohistorical contexts, including South Korea and Taiwan. The second theme I wanted to discuss is the definition of democracy as it unfolded in Korea. As a thought experiment, I got curious while reading the Mrs. Han's story. I got curious, what if the Asian financial crisis occurred not in 1997, but let's say before South Korea's democratization in 1987? And if that happened, how would Mrs. Han and other Koreans have responded to the crisis? And the state and also the national community's call for participation in the national drive. So in that scenario, can those engagements to help my country be interpreted as manifestations of civic duty to democracy? And here the emphasis is on democracy. So this question eventually leads us to question the definitions of civic duty and democracy itself. So following Luebbert's definition, the book conceptualizes duty as something perceived as an absolute value and an end in itself. What does the sense of duty reside then? That's a remaining question for me. So the book posits that it lies in people's minds, following Luebbert's tradition, and so does nationalism. And I think this comment is connected to Dr. Ichijo's first question about the function of nationalism and the definition of nationalism. Because precisely speaking, the South Korean public has come to think national identity and belonging are intrinsic and to act on that belief, which is part of the book's argument. So it should be noted that a sense of moral obligation is regularized and regimented through repeated everyday practices mediated by various institutions, including but not limited to legal institutions, schools, family, military, and media. So if the nation-state linkage is so strong in the South Korean public's popular perception, and if the state is the political infrastructure or system of institution that governs over a defined physical territory, I quote from page 22, that South Koreans' understanding of civic duty, civic duty coming out of strong national identification may quintessentially be tied to the operation of political infrastructure and institutions that cannot be reduced to purely ideological level. So this is, I think, where we can actually put in a critical conversation with Weber, I guess. So this is where the question of how democracy is enacted, practiced, and upheld in South Korean public politics becomes so important. So in this vein, I would like to hear a little bit more about the role of political infrastructure and institutions, including voting systems and policies and tax enforcement schemes, military conscription rules, for example, in this book's analysis. And I think it will really help us to explore more nuanced analysis without limiting our discussion to the ideological level. And the last theme is the scope of civic duty and methodological conundrums in studying the subject. And I have huge respect to this methodological rigor, because I don't think I would have been able to, I would be able to pull out this comparative political project. So while reading this book, I was curious to hear more about the conundrums you might have had as a researcher and also as a writer. For example, I wonder if you have encountered specific challenges in narrowing down the scope of civic duty for this research, because in the book, 3 examples were particularly chosen as representatives of civic duty, including the duty to vote, the duty to pay taxes, and the duty to defend the country. So in the South Korean context, would you say that there are different kinds of civic duty that may form contention rather than going hand in hand as one package? In that case, how might the public's perception of the strong nation-state linkage factor in different iterations of civic duty differently? For example, I personally found, as gender and sexuality studies scholar, I thought military service is actually a very fascinating site to study this question as an iteration of the duty of national defense. So I'd like to use this case to close my discussion. And in the book, overseas Korean men's narratives were chosen as discourse data, especially for those who chose to do compulsory national military service, despite the fact that there are technical leeways for them to avoid it. So while very much appreciating the unique value of these narratives, I was curious to know a little bit more about the theoretical implications of presupposing an antithetical relation between institutionally enforced duty and free choice coming out of one's sense of civic duty. And I think it would have been a great challenge for researcher to decipher the messages through those essays. So especially in chapter 3. So the author clarified in chapter 3 that male South Korean nationals with foreign permanent residency or dual citizenship can wait it out until they reach the age when the legal obligation expires. But that said, it comes with some limitations. For example, they cannot make prolonged visits in South Korea. They cannot study in educational institutions for a prolonged time without clearing the box. And also, there are restrictions in working as well. So such intricacies are partly why I'm curious to hear more from the author about her choice of narrative samples collected by the Military Manpower Administration. The Korean government didn't change it to Military Human Power or Military People Power Association, still Military Manpower Administration. So the author, which is telling, right? So the author thoughtfully acknowledges a potential bias stemming from the fact that the NMA's collection excludes the narratives of those who chose not to serve. And I actually think this is not really inherently a methodological weakness because she acknowledges such context and consider that part in the analysis. But what motivated my question is the fact that these narrative samples were actually from anthologies published by the MMA as an outcome of its annual essay contest, with prompts and aims provided to contestants. And I would really appreciate an opportunity to learn how her navigated the methodological dilemma regarding this narrative sample selectiveness and the MMA's political curation of these essays. And delving into the role of state apparatuses like MMA can lead us to think more critically and intersectionally about the function of national narratives. For example, completing military service duty has long been considered an important element of hegemonic masculinity in South Korea and state institutions like MMA. So state institutions like MMA have been tremendously invested in amalgamating national and gendered ideologies. So more attention to such intersectional operation of nationalism can be, I believe, beneficial for honing our discussion on how collective stories influence different people differently, especially considering the unique place of gendered militarism in South Korea, Cold War modernity, and its most recent ongoing variations. And again, thank you so much for intriguing analysis, and I have more questions, but we should attest to the richness of this book. So I would like to stop here for the sake of time, and hopefully we'll have future opportunities to continue this conversation. Thank you.
So I think I might have misunderstood my mandate, and I did 10 to 12 minutes per commentator, so I will try to condense this as much as possible as I stand here in front of you. So I thought that it would be helpful to group my responses into sort of three large categories or themes that came up across both commentators. And those themes are sort of conceptual definitions, and then questions about the process of national story making, and then essentially questions about, future or, hey, this was published in 22, but given academic publishing cycles, that means most of the data were collected in 13 to 15. And so how do we update a decade later? So I'm gonna sort of categorize my responses into those three buckets. So I want to start with Professor Ichijo's comments about conceptual sharpness, and she asked, what is nationalism in your book? I'm approaching nationalism in this book really from the lens of the ordinary national member, who's not typically walking around, maybe a little bit different today, but not typically walking around thinking about what is my nationalist ideology, but is more experienced in the everyday life as a sense of national identification. So that includes both the self-categorization of I'm an American, or I'm a Korean, or I'm Taiwanese, as well as the feeling of attachment that you have to that identity, which can vary even across members who similarly identify as part of the same nation. And to me, it's really that sense of belonging, the feeling that this is my nation, that generates that intrinsic sense of obligation to then contribute to it and even sacrifice for it. But at this point, this is duty to nation. It's a kind of collective communal duty. It is not yet politicized into civic duty. That political transformation, the book argues, from communal duty to civic duty, which really is, to go back to Weber, like a more general sense of political obligation to the state, right? That happens through national stories. And, when national stories are able to frame the state as an extension of, or sort of a representative of the best interests of my national community, then duty to nation motivates duty to the state. And it can drive a sense of civic duty to sacrifice time, money, and at times even lives for the sake of that country. So this explains cases like what I opened with South Koreans donating, their gold wedding rings to this national gold drive during a financial crisis, but also more mundane acts of civic duty as well, like taking the time to go vote, right? Or never really thinking about how do I shave off a little bit on this tax compliance form. But when national stories frame the state as kind of an oppressor or even a betrayer of what I regard to be my national people, then duty to that nation can motivate a kind of almost, for lack of a better term, an anti-civic duty that makes it one's moral obligation to actually contest and resist and sometimes even rebel against the demands of that state. And we see this dynamic with the Sunflower Movement, which happened right after I finished my fieldwork in Taiwan. But if you think about the Sunflower Movement, the rationale for that among college students and youth in Taiwan was it wasn't so much about the economic principle behind the CSSTA trade agreement with China, but really a reaction to the KMT president at the time, Ichijo's kind of processual backdoor way of reaching that deal with Beijing. A repertoire that's deeply ingrained in Taiwanese national stories of the state, always excluding or actually betraying the best interests of the Taiwanese people. That really kind of triggered that level of response. And in more extreme examples, and maybe a little bit provocative, but we also see this kind of nationally driven anti-civic duty in interviews with leaders of the January 6th, I'm not sure what to call it anymore, event. If you actually listen to these, read these interviews, it's quite fascinating because they describe the storming of the U.S. Capitol as the ultimate act of patriotism. And I believe that is what they believe. To save our nation, right, from the reaches of the establishment. So, this kind of anti-civic duty can also happen in much more quiet ways as well, like, choosing not to vote in this particular election or choosing not to respond to the asks of this state because I don't see this to represent my nation or my people. And, in the examples that I just illustrated, I've purposely drawn from cases from predominantly ethnic nations as well as predominantly civic nations because I want to illustrate that, while these categories still, I think, have useful descriptive purposes, in themselves, hopefully the book convinces you that they have little bearing on what nationalisms actually do. In South Korea, one of the most racialized instances of ethnic nationalism in the world, you still see attachment to that kind of ethnic nation yielding these civic duty benefits. Whereas in Taiwan, sort of an equally, I would say even at the point that I was in the field, it was already transforming from sort of an ethnic-based national identity to something else. And I think it's still in transition. But, in sort of what at least began as sort of a nationalism founded on ethnic difference from being, not Chinese, that leading to not as strong of relations with civic duty. And so, global politics today, I think, really demands us to understand not just what nationalism is, but, how does it behave and why does it do that, right? Why does nationalism become violent and illiberal in some instances? And when does it actually valiantly protect the state in which it lives or quietly support political stability? I think to answer those questions, the book's contribution is that it's not so much the ethnic or civic content of nationalism, but really its context, right? Its relational legacy with the state in which it lives, other nations, even relations with other co-members of the same national community that are embedded in these stories, that is what is doing the work. And I think thinking about nationalism more as a contextual phenomenon, frankly, just frees us, I think, from the dichotomy of the good versus bad, the West versus the rest type of framework that has been, I think, unfairly attached to the civic versus ethnic divide that exists in the literature. At this point, I want to go to Professor Im's really short comments, also to do with the idea of concept, that she really brings out the idea of what is the role of democracy here? How do we think about democratic infrastructures and the way that civic duty manifests? So this book is about civic duty in democracies, partly because civic duty is particularly important to democracies and especially liberal democracies that in theory have less access to coercion. But also because I think that even with all of its flaws that have been made fair, that many of us still believe that democracy still is the most fair form of government that we have today. But civic duty is not in any way unique to democracy. It's a form of political loyalty to the state, and exists in democratic states as well as authoritarian states. And so I think the book's argument is best characterized as a national theory of civic duty in democracies. And indeed, authoritarian states like China, like North Korea, have been wildly successful in mobilizing nationalism to instill civic duty to their regimes. And civic duty in those regimes look quite different from the kinds of civic duties. I mean, there are overlaps, in fact, but look quite different depending on the actual regime. And so, how civic duty is practiced in different types of states, but also even within democracies of different origins and different infrastructures, the way that civic duty manifests is going to be quite different. What is an act of good citizenship in one kind of state might be quite different from civic duty and how that looks like in other states. So part of the book was to really kind of divorce civic duty from being a uniquely democratic concept. And there's new work here that's empirically grounded that shows that, for instance, people in Russia vote in elections out of civic duty, that is a strong motivator for turnout in even electoral autocracies. And I think the point about the infrastructure, right, is sort of the I think the way that I think about it is that these different democratic or political infrastructures construct the repertoires and the specific behavioral scripts of what people deem to be good citizenship. But again, that concept itself is something that varies with context, even among democracies. And so, liberal democracies have always kind of shied away from the idea of too much nationalism, partly due to the horrors of World War II. And it's really that disconnect at sort of a broader level that the book really wants to kind of course correct. The problem in many democracies today is actually not too much nationalism. It's the loudness of certain types of nationalisms that actually weaken or sever that nation-state tie for particular subgroups within the nation. And what we have is actually not enough, in my mind, of the right kind of nationalism or national stories that can strengthen those ties. And so the second theme was about process. And I'm gonna kind of jump between the two amazing commentators today, because there were actually, I thought, a lot of intellectual connections there. So great, right? Okay, great. We want these types of national stories. How do you get that? This is usually the question I get from more of a policy audience. So how do we tell these stories that build these strong linkages and all those great things? And as with all stories, national stories are part reality and part fiction. They are real in the sense that they are usually based on real historical experiences or events of the national people. So you can't make these out of thin air. But they're also constructed and imagined in the sense that they are products of hegemonic interpretation of those events, usually by ruling political elites, although the role of sort of national and cultural entrepreneurs, I think, is much more important in truly sort of free, open communication democratic societies. And so the process of narrative construction is, of the act of telling and retelling these national stories is never a given in the sense that the outcome is preordained. It's always political and it's always a product of power relations. So I think Professor Im brings up a really important point here, which is that it's important not to gloss over the messy and sometimes quite violent process by which you get these kinds of national stories. I mean, even the kind of right kind of national stories that I talk about in South Korea that produce this kind of thick identity-based civic duty, these were products of authoritarian rule. The state, the South Korean state had a complete narrative monopoly over the historical interpretation of the Korean War. The Korean War, which most people think as sort of a remnant of the Cold War, was actually a civil war between competing nationalist factions over how to best lead this newly independent nation that had just become free from Japanese colonialism. And there was a northern faction that championed sort of a self-reliant, ethno-nationalist view of how Korea should be, that ended up becoming aligned with the Soviets. And a southern faction that supported more of a global vision of Korea that was now more embedded in and part of the immersion in the world order at the time, that then ends up being aligned with the United States. And it's over those 3 brutal years that, literally kin are killing kin. That's how deep those nationalist divisions of, what is the right vision for our national community were. And so it's important, I think, not to mistake South Korea's racial homogeneity or even ethnic homogeneity for national homogeneity. That was not a given. Right? Those two things are separate. There was an entire political process that yielded strong nation-state linkage in a place like Korea. It was not a natural result of simply having a high degree of racial homogeneity. And so to really dive deeply into this processual aspect of how these stories were constructed, after the war, in South Korea, the southern faction becomes the ruling faction and controls the authoritarian state and faces an existential crisis, right? It's poor, it's ravaged from most of the fighting happening in the southern part, and it's lacking the natural resources that North Korea has. And so what it does is it enacts a series of deliberately and carefully constructed policies, which include things like the National Chart of Education, which is literally a multi-paragraph statement in front of every public textbook that if you were a school age during that time, you had to recite by heart. Right? And it includes sort of the virtuous character values of what it means to be Korean, etc. So things like the National Chart of Education, the New Village movement, which is part of South Korea's developmental project, which really kind of started to embed this idea of the state as a partner with localized movements to pursue self-reliant development, as well as a really broad national post-war vaccination campaign. That, in the post-war period, there were a lot of fatality rate of infants was really high, and so the authoritarian state enacts a mandatory vaccination campaign. So this drove me nuts when, after South Korea's COVID success, you got the usual plethora of news media articles saying it's Confucianism, and it's like, no, it's actually infrastructure. It's historical, historicized repertoires of nation-state relationship, of the state being literally in some ways an extension of the racialized national body that led to that high level of compliance with very intrusive policies to track COVID that did a lot of the work. And so, the authoritarian state in South Korea cultivates this very strong linkage because of its survival, very effectively using the racialized bloodline metaphor to frame the state as an extension of the national body and as its sole protector. And that's why, terms like nara, that Professor Im brought up, which literally does translate to country, but almost always in Korea is used with 우리나라, right? Our country. That term, when you speak to Koreans, it like intertwines both nation and state. And so what's fascinating is when I ran these focus groups to figure out how to design my survey experiments, etc., it became pretty clear to me that when I tried to literally back translate identification with the country, the term became a problem. People were like, well, isn't nara already all of these things together? It was so ingrained that those two things were one of the same. And so actually in Korea, in the survey measures, I ended up using national pride. So 한국인인 게 얼마나 자랑스럽습니까? Because 국가, which is state, ended up triggering political ideology. And 민족 as well, 민족 literally meaning not even technically nation, but more national, the national people. Also had the same issue of bringing in Yaya. So I was like, how proud do you feel to be Korean? Right? Was actually the measure that I ended up using there. But also because the state fiercely protected that narrative monopoly by brutally persecuting remnants of the pro-North faction that basically got caught when the armistice was drawn in the South. And any kind of suspected communist loyalists were brutally imprisoned, tortured, and many of them murdered, right? And so just because the right kind of national stories can do good things for democracy doesn't mean that the process of being there is necessarily democratic or frankly even humane. China, for instance, under Xi Jinping has done great lengths to cultivate to revive this Han Chinese idea of nationhood, and as a result, we saw, systematic massacres in places like Xinjiang. And so, national unity, I think, almost always comes at a very high price, and political leaders often have to make really, morally difficult trade-offs in those early stages of nation building, but also during seismic periods of national rebuilding, which brings me to kind of the future here. National stories, as I said, always political process and therefore never stagnant. And I think the book captures a particular moment in time in both South Korea and Taiwan. So I want to kind of address how does the book age? Would I find different things if I went into the field at this very moment? So I want to sort of end my comments on that note, and I think that'll invite a lot of questions. So, would the findings be different now? I think that we would find evidence of a shift in South Korea, and this goes to questions from both discussants. What's happening in South Korea, we just had a snap presidential election. I was just on a panel earlier today discussing the fallouts of that. What we're seeing is that progressive left, which was the remnants of the pro-North faction that were silenced during the authoritarian rule, the silence narrative, is finally now emerging as a real, formidable, and winning force in politics after years of being really functionally the political underdog. This is the group that has historical lineages back to the original northern faction that was persecuted during authoritarian rule. So as you have the silenced narrative emerge and gain political clout, what you're seeing in South Korea. There was a lot of talk about it was polarization, but it was a particular kind of polarization. It was the return of the nationalist polarization that had driven the Korean War in the first place, and frankly was never resolved. So you have that rise of the opposition now combined with growing public disillusion with the conservative brand of national stories, especially among the younger generation in South Korea, which hasn't directly experienced these national stories of miraculous development, sort of the dragon rising from the stream type of metaphors used in South Korea to describe the rise of social mobility that followed the developmental era. The younger generation has never really experienced this. And so I think there's ample room for the emergent left in South Korea to construct new kinds of national stories that depict a different kind of moral relationship between the national people and the state. I think that this brings in room for women to be brought into the national story as central figures. Professor Ichijo, in her written comments, had a really fascinating question about, if nation-state linkage is so strong, why do you have declining birth rate in places like South Korea? Shouldn't women, out of duty to the nation, want to have more children? I think this is fascinating, so I want to take a little bit of a detour here. Because it also relates to Professor Im's point about the hypermasculinity of Korea's national stories. So, women in Korea have occupied a really complicated narrative space in terms of national stories. During modernization, men were asked to enact kind of state sacrificial labor in the sense of actually going into the labor force, but also contributing to security issues by serving in the military. Women were tasked during this time to be the keepers of tradition in the home by being wise wives and wise mothers, but in a modern way. What do I mean by that? I mean by it was a state developmental project to actually curb fertility and spread this notion of the modern family as a nuclear family with no more than 2 children, who were highly educated and who were going to be competitive in this new meritocratic capitalist society. This isn't just posters and rhetoric. I mean, literally contraceptives were being handed out, and there were birth planning centers that were stationed across the country to curb fertility, because you can increase GDP in 2 ways, right? Increase the numerator or decrease the denominator. So it was an explicit developmental project. And so now the state is all of a sudden flipping that narrative script on Korean women and doing really, in some ways, kind of an about face, and kind of blaming Korean women now for being, not patriotic or unwilling to have more children, without actually granting women the agency to help construct that new role that they're supposed to play in South Korea's national story.